Good evening and welcome to tonight's talk. My name is Jonathan Shannon, Associate Dean for External Relations in the Division of Arts and Humanities here at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Very pleased to welcome tonight's lecturer, Dr. Rami Zurayk from the American University of Beirut. He's a professor in the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences in the Department of Landscape Design and Ecosystem Management. He's a member of a number of international bodies dealing with food security and nutrition, including the Committee of Food Security and many others. He's a founding member of the Arab Food Sovereignty Network, which is an advisory board to SEAL, the Social and Economic Action for Lebanon, as well as numerous other institutions. His work focuses on the political ecology of Arab food security and its linkages with agrarian systems and questions in the region as well as internationally. His publications are too numerous to list tonight, but they include Crisis and Conflict in Agriculture, The Agrarian Roots of the Arab Uprisings, Control Food, Control People, The Struggle for Food Security in Gaza, and Food Farming and Freedom, Sowing the Arab Spring. He's a graduate of the American University of Beirut, as well as from Oxford University. Tonight, we're very pleased to have a continuation of our COVID-19 series at the Institute with his talk called Food and Nutrition Security in the Age of COVID-19. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rami Zurayk.
Thank you very much. I think this is my cue, and I will start by sharing my screen if I can manage that. And here it is. Jonathan?
Absolutely, we can see your screen, Doctor.
Okay, so then good evening again. It's afternoon here, and I hope you like my background. In reality, I'm on an island in the Pacific on the beach. It's a pleasure to deliver this lecture today, and I hope that the gods of the internet will show clemency and allow us to be together during this hour or so without undue interruption. I will be talking about food security in the age of COVID-19. This may be like a topic that has been addressed at length since the beginning of the crisis. Crisis, I should say, because there are so many of them. But I hope to be able to shed light on a few angles and aspects that can often be neglected, especially, but not exclusively, in the Arab region. My essential point here in this talk today, my points are that food security, and for this next hour, I shall consider food security, food and nutrition security, and food security and nutrition to be a synonymous terms. So food security is one of the outcomes of the working of a very complex socio-ecological system, the food system. And that's a good understanding and planning of food security can only happen if we understand well the operation of the food system. That's like one big main point. My second point is that the food system in the Arab region is fragile and unsustainable, in spite of some indications of robustness and even resilience in some of the Arab countries. My third point is that the food system needs to be made anti-fragile, to use the concepts coined by Nassim Taleb. And I will give a few indications on how to go about achieving that. I will be talking for this next 40 minutes or so according to this general outline. First, I will present a series of vignettes about some or the other aspects of food security today and in the age of COVID-19. I will then ask, what is food security, and provide some answer that will help us all get on the same page. Following that, I will introduce the concept of food system and talk about fragility and resilience. I'll then move to a rapid overview of how COVID-19 impacted food systems globally and what were the generic responses. We will then move together to an overview of the state of Arab food security, and we'll seek to understand using the concept of food systems, the interactions between Arab food security and COVID-19. And finally, I will wrap up with a conclusion and some takeaway messages. Now, COVID-19 appeared in a world in crisis, an economic crisis of planetary proportions, a rapid decline in oil prices, and an overwhelming climate crisis seem to have taken hold of the world and are not letting go of it. Everywhere you look, you see conflicts, poverty, inequalities, a deeper north-south divide, decreasing state investments in social protections, increasing diet-related diseases, an agriculture that is essentially driven by production for profit in a world where 30% of what we produce is lost or wasted, a deepening metabolic rift, and an open consumption of nature embedded in the food we eat. This state of affairs encourages the jump of diseases from animals to humans and adds to the burden created by our seemingly endless demand for food in all its forms and shapes. This is the topography of the world in which we live today. Let me now present a few vignettes that allow us to see the different facets of food security in the time of COVID-19. One, it's a hungry world. Current estimates are that, and these are from the SOFI, the FAO's State of Food Insecurity in the world. The current estimates are that about 700 million people are hungry, or about 9% of the world's population. Up by 10 million people in 1 year, and by nearly 60 million people in 5 years. We're not doing better, we're doing worse. The number of people affected by severe food insecurity, which is another measure that approximates hunger, show a similar upward trend. In 2019, close to 750 million, or 1 in 10 people in the world, were exposed to severe levels of food insecurity. The map here shows the percent of the population that cannot afford a healthy diet. And we will see later why a healthy diet is so very important. 3 billion people, mostly in the global south, cannot afford a healthy diet. Note also something of importance here. The gray color indicates the inability to get the data, the lack of data. And that is a major issue in the Arab region. You can see some of those countries are in the Arab region. That is a major hurdle for planning, monitoring, and evaluating policies and actions related to food security. 2, COVID-19 worsens food insecurity. According to the World Food Programme, which just received the Nobel Prize for Peace, the COVID-19 pandemic could almost double the number of people suffering acute hunger, pushing it to more than 250 million by the end of 2020. The impact is not limited to poorer countries. Today, from a recent report, in the US, almost 30 million people do not have enough to eat. That's in the US. Food insecurity affects, in the US, predominantly households with women, children, and communities of color. So food insecurity does affect everyone. Same, it's not only a north-south divide, there is a south in the north, and of course a north in the south. 3, obesity is a food security issue. Obesity and overweight were linked to an estimated 5 million deaths per year worldwide before COVID-19. Calories overconsumption is as bad as calories underconsumption. All countries are impacted. You can see here from the map, rich and poor. Although, and you can see that in the chart, the percent of people who are overweight in a certain country increases quickly with an increase in the per capita GDP. There are not all poor countries are obese or have high levels of obesity, but once you reach a certain level of wealth, then obesity becomes a big problem. Obesity, and that's 4, obesity and overweight interact with COVID-19 and worsen its impact. In the recent study by Popkin et al., and that's 2020, found that people with obesity and COVID-19 were 113% more likely to be hospitalized and 48% more likely to die. Obesity and overweight have themselves become a pandemic. 5, what explains obesity in poorer income groups? I'll go very quickly because that could be the subject of an entire seminar or even a course. But research shows that the main coping strategy, and understandably so, the main coping strategy for the poor is to sacrifice diet quality for keeping adequate calories intake. You can see here how the poorer households get, the less they consume fruits and vegetables, and the more they consume fats and sugar. So that's the empty calories. Now, the reason, of course, is that healthy diets, like fresh fruits and vegetable-based, are way too expensive for most. Healthy diets were found to be, on average, 5 times more expensive than diets that only meets dietary energy needs through starchy staples. So we can't really go to the poor and say, well, if there is no food, why don't you just eat fruits and vegetables? Incidentally, this is Marie Antoinette de France. Now, 6, our dietary choices have an impact on the environment. When we eat food, but we're also eating the environment. The figure here is from the 2020 Global Nutrition Report. It confirms that animal-sourced food have a disproportionate impact on greenhouse gas emissions, as does the production of staple grains, 60% of which are used as animal fodder. So the choices that we make have an impact on the environment and therefore have an impact on the precursors of farming. And 7, we are nowhere near getting better. The world's economy continues to worsen, and the pandemic fears and rising prices of commodities are spurring a global stockpile of food. So if everybody's buying food and trying to stockpile it, that changes the market completely. Wheat prices are continuing to increase today. They are at their highest in the past 6 years. That doesn't bode very well. Now, what, you may ask, links all of these vignettes together? Well, for one, they all involved different facets of the complex relationship that exists between food and people. And 2, one of the outcomes of this complex relationship is food security and nutrition. But there are other outcomes. We have seen that there are also environmental outcomes. There are also economic outcomes in the way we hoard food, we work, we influence markets. And there are also social equity outcomes. Not everybody is affected equally when there are issues with food security and nutrition. These outcomes are all inextricably linked, and we really cannot address one without addressing the others. This is an important point. I've been talking a lot about food security, and I feel that it is important at this stage that after presenting all of these vignettes and possibly, getting some confusion, before stringing them all together, let me just set out the definition of what food security is, so we can put that aside and come back to it whenever we need it. The most commonly used definition is that of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. It reminds us, of course, what we have known for quite a while, which is that food security is not the quantity of food that is produced or imported in a country. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food which meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Conventionally, we have always thought of food security as having 4 dimensions: availability of food, well, whether food is there or not; access, whether we're able to access the food, to get it economically or physically; utilization of food, which essentially tells us about how do we prepare food, how do we eat it, the diets that we eat; and stability, which essentially means if I have food today, will I have it tomorrow? Recently, and that's like a few months ago, 2 more dimensions covering the entire definition now have been added: agency and sustainability, illustrating the equity dimension for agency and the environmental dimension for sustainability. This definition, of course, has got some shortcomings, for me at least. For example, it fails to inform us how do we get to food security, and more importantly, who is responsible for achieving that for all people at all times. But knowing who is responsible for achieving it and how do we achieve it is important, especially when we're trying to prevent further declines in food security caused by the combination of factors I have listed earlier, including the COVID-19 black swan. Now, how do we approach this endeavor? We need to realize that food and nutrition security is just one of the outcomes of the long journey of food from seed to mouth. The vehicle of this journey is known as the food system. The food system is a systematic approach that can be used then to map and comprehend the processes leading, among other outcomes, to food security. Now, but what is the food system? But it is, and I love the term because I work on this, it is a socio-ecological system, a system that interfaces people and nature. And it's formed of biophysical and social factors linked together through feedback mechanisms. It is characterized, like all systems, by a number of systems components, inputs and outputs. It has positive and negative feedback loops inside it, and its operation is influenced by a set of external drivers. It is also exposed to shocks and stressors that affect its operation. You can see from the drawing here, the picture here, that the journey of food from field to mouth is no direct flight. This slide offers perhaps a clearer picture. Sorry. We can see here the 4 main components of the food system. the food supply chains, the food environment, the individual level filter, and the consumer behavior, all of which working together lead us to the diets, which in turn also produces a number of outcomes. And these outcomes include, of course, food and nutrition security, including health outcomes, social outcomes, economic outcomes, and environmental outcomes. I will come back to these. And I have here to acknowledge Professor Jessica Fanzo from Johns Hopkins, who has been the main brain behind mapping the food system the way it has been adapted by my team and myself in this chart. Now, these different components themselves include subcomponents. For example, in the food supply chains, we have the entire farming, which is the food production systems and the input supply system, but we also have the retail and marketing. In the food environments, we look at food availability, food affordability, but also at how is food presented to us in society, advertising, images. The individual level filter tell us about our internal economics, the income and purchasing power of the household or the individual. There are cognitive dimensions in that. How much do I know about food? There are aspirational issues. Food as distinction, after the French sociologist Bourdieu. And finally, the consumer behavior, which is what do I decide to acquire? How do I prepare my meals? How do I store my food to prevent waste, losses of nutrients, or physical losses themselves? The diets are a result of that. The system produces four main outputs, as I said before. We're often focused on the food and nutrition security outcome as they link immediately to our diets. Recently, and I showed you one of the vignettes about the environmental impacts of our diet, we have started to talk more about the environmental outputs. Our dietary choices have an impact on the environment. There are also, of course, economic outputs. Is the system economically viable? And there are also social outputs. Does the system provide decent livelihoods? And are the benefits equitably distributed? Is the operation of the system predicated on the exploitation of labor? We have seen that this issue has been extremely important throughout the COVID-19 crisis, as food workers jumped immediately, in the same way as nurses, from being underrated jobs to being frontline jobs. But before that, nobody paid any attention to food workers. And we have a lot of data to show the level of exploitation that underlies the fruits and the vegetables we eat routinely. This system, this big system, is modulated by a number of external drivers or determinants which can either facilitate or hinder its flow, and which will define the quality and adequacy of its outputs. The drivers include environmental, technological, political, and the political economy of food is supremely important, sociocultural, economic, and finally demographic determinants. Let me illustrate something while I'm on that slide. Very often, we link food security, which is one of the outcomes of the food system, to farming, which is one subcomponent of one component, and demography. There are too many people in the world. We need to produce more food in order for everyone to be secure. How many times have you heard this litany? Well, this litany resembles in nothing the reality of the situation. This particular system, of course, is exposed to shocks, which can cause crises. Some shocks are slow onset, such as climate change. Others are rapid onsets, such as pandemic, economic, and financial crises. And as is common in our region here, war, occupation, and conflict. These are some of the big shocks. A system that produces outputs here, that do not threaten the continued operation of the system is called a sustainable system. The food system is therefore only sustainable if it nurtures human health through adequate levels of food security and nutrition. But it is only sustainable if it is non-exploitative and culturally respectful. It is sustainable only if it is economically viable for all and fair. It is only sustainable if it conserves the environment instead of damaging it. And believe me, we're still a long way from this. Now, when a system is exposed to a shock, and we've talked about these shocks, it can either fail, resist, improve slightly and then fail, or improve and become stronger. In other words, it can either be fragile, robust, resilient, or anti-fragile. We want our systems to be sustainable and resilient. At least we should aim at making them anti-fragile. They gain from shocks, they benefit from black swan events, unforeseeable events. Let's not forget that resilience and anti-fragility need to apply to all four outputs. We have no use for a system that can be resilient in the sense that if affected by a shock, it can continue to wreak havoc in human and environmental health. So the resilience of the current food system without its sustainability dimension is not something that may be the answer to all our woes. Now that we have constructed our theoretical lens about how to study food security and nutrition in the time of COVID, let's see if we can understand the impacts of COVID-19 on the food systems and how they are likely, these impacts, to affect the outcomes, food security being, of course, one of those outcomes. We have moved now to a broader vision, a systemic approach to understanding the impact of shocks, COVID-19, on food security and nutrition. And we have also agreed, at least I am in agreement with myself on that it is extremely difficult to dissociate the impacts on the environment, on society, from the impacts on food and nutrition security. And any attempt to do that will certainly be met with failure eventually. Let's look at what were the COVID-19 impacts on the global food system generically, and see how countries have responded to that. These here are some of the documented impacts of COVID-19 on the food systems. I have selected these as an example, and also because they're prevalent and we could find them almost everywhere. I am sure we can find some more, and there has been a lot that has been written on the subject. The literature it has been extremely large and wide on this. Now, the pandemic, of course, shook the global food supply chain. It affected food prices because countries banned exports, creating market shortages. But we were lucky that this impact was not very large, because it happened that this particular year we had bumper crops almost everywhere and almost in all commodities. So that was really lucky in here. Now, the pandemic also affected production as lockdown workers could not reach fields and harvest their crops. And you can see here that the difficulties in moving from one place to another drove this Indian farmer to feed his cows with strawberries, meaning that this particular person probably plants strawberries for export outside of the borders of his community and imports from somewhere else to feed these animals. Now, strawberries are not very much used for the cows, and without the feed, the cow will certainly not be productive. The food system that we know of in its specialization was not really prepared for this type of lockdown measures. This particular issue affected the component one, which is the food supply chains. Now, disruptions in the logistics also blocked access to markets. Urban food traders were hit very hard, especially informal traders, who were also impacted by lockdown measures. So not only could they not have access to food that they could retail, but they were also under the lockdown measures. They could not go out and sell. Now in Africa, informal vendors are between 70 and 80% of all food purchases. So that makes a lot of difference. Now, the economic recessions that accompanied the pandemic caused unemployment and livelihood and income losses. Now, that affected, of course, the individual level filters, the ability to spend, whereas the others were still affecting the food supply chain. This, of course, caused a shift in demand patterns among consumers. So they became poorer, and we saw early on what happens when people become poorer. They go to less healthy options, and that, of course, affects consumers' choices and eventually diets. So the food system in its entirety was influenced and impacted. And of course, this resulted in a decline in the quality of the diet in the poorer communities, which were disproportionately affected by the illness, directly by having more people getting sick, and indirectly because it made them lose more of their livelihoods. Thus, the pandemic revealed the deep inequalities that exist in the food system and exposed its failures, the failure in its outcomes, and the increased levels of food insecurity disproportionately in poor and marginalized communities. That is a partial failure of one of the outputs, if you think again in terms of system. It also caused financial losses for small-scale producers and food workers, while transnational corporations continued to make large profits. And we can check out Bloomberg today about the profits that are currently being made by the big transnational food trade corporations. Today, there was an article today. So that is, of course, also a partial failure of the economic outcome. Now, one thing we can quickly note is that we know, even after all this time that we've been studying food security, food and nutrition security, we know much more about how the food supply chain was affected. A lot of the research went in this direction. We know a little bit better about the nutrition. We know little about how the food environment was affected, but much, much less about the interactions between these, because we never really took time to look at all of this as a system in which the different components interact with each other, in which the inability of the small producer to reach the fields impacts eventually his or her diet. Now, what were the global responders? How did the world respond to that? Well, countries generally responded rather predictably by boosting the food supply through more production and more trade. So they responded on component one, food supply chains, because of the idea, the essentially Malthusian idea that in order to remove food security, you need to make more food available and produce more food. This was also an opportunity to anchor the system deeper into digital technologies through e-shopping and e-deliveries, which solved partly the quarantining issues for a few, for those who are connected and those who have the ability. So that resolved partly issues in the food environment for a certain segment of society. Now, government stepped in and they enacted fiscal and monetary responses, such as reducing taxes, delaying payment of taxes, and providing limited cash transfers. The US and elsewhere have done that. So that affected a little bit component 2 and 3. Now, food banks spread very rapidly and provided the basis for food-based safety net. People have done that a lot, and they've established food relief programs, which impacted the individual level filters. In some countries, essentially, but not exclusively in the North, healthy diets were sometimes promoted. So essentially, there was a response almost at every level, every component of the food system, but not at every subcomponent of the food system, because we didn't pay attention to that, only to those components who appeared to be clear and convenient, and an easy choice to be made. Now, we will see later that that may not be the best approach, that this may be the time to open up this food system, understand really how it works, and how each of the subcomponents, if tweaked, can deliver a more sustainable, a more resilient, a more fair, a fairer, a more equitable outcome in terms of food security, environment, economics, and society. Let's focus now on what's happening at the level of the Arab region. And that brings me to the third part of my talk today, third and last. Now, let's first start with an overview of the main food security issues in the Arab region. For this, I will use the data set from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Overview of Food Security and Nutrition in the Near East and North Africa, 2019, because the 2020 version hasn't appeared yet. These were the main findings, and I think it's compelling reading. I absolutely recommend that you download that. It's free. But conflict is a primary reason for hunger in our region here. Undernutrition and deficiencies of micronutrients in children under 5 years of age in this region are of particular concern. The Arab states have the second highest prevalence of obesity and overweight after the Americas. And of course, a lot of countries do subsidize and have food security policies that subsidize either production or certain commodities, but generally these policies had a negative impact because they generally favor energy-rich staple food production in the agriculture sector, wherever this happens, and that's not in Lebanon, but in other countries, without sufficient attention to promoting nutrient-rich foods and fruits and vegetables. So we subsidize the same stuff that does not really agree very well with either environment or health, a point that is worth pondering about. And the report, of course, concludes, and I think this is a very important conclusion, the food systems in the Arab states and the policies that support them have contributed to poor nutritional outcomes by failing to provide adequate, safe, diversified, and nutritious food for all that is economically, culturally, and socially acceptable. This was the situation on the eve of the pandemic. A failed food system that was not providing health to the people. Now, when the pandemic hit, of course, there were several impacts. And let's look a little bit together at what were those impacts and how did the various countries respond. Now, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic affected the entire food system. And now we know that we can map that throughout the food system. The intensity of the impact, of course, varied quite expectedly between conflict and non-conflict countries. So more impact on conflict countries, less impact on non-conflict countries. Between rich and poor countries, that's the Arab region. Some of the richest countries in the world and some of the poorest countries in the world mired in wars, conflict, and occupation. But because we do not routinely collect or produce data, provide the data, or share data on food security and nutrition in the region here, it is difficult to assess those impacts directly, especially as this particular crisis in the Arab region was compounded with a crash in oil prices, with locust swarms in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, with a financial crisis reaching meltdown proportions in Lebanon, with civil unrest in Lebanon and in Iraq, and among others, and civil war in Syria and Libya, while Palestine and Iraq remain under one form or another of occupation. These have caused severe economic impact on the Arab states, with total losses estimated at $1.2 trillion, and expectations that 7.1 million workers will lose their jobs. There were also fears of unrest associated with food shortages and increased food insecurity, similar to what happened in the 2008 food crisis. But because the Arab countries are the largest food importers in the world, all the global impacts that I talked about before resounded very strongly internally. Now, how did the Arab countries respond to those stresses on the food systems that COVID-19 has caused? Well, they actually, were on the track for the response, quite refreshingly. And they tried to build the capacities for resilience inside the system. With my research team, we have systematically reviewed those responses. Here's a glimpse of the main ways countries have addressed the pandemic's impact on their food system. At the level of the food supply chains, countries that could afford it implemented an aggressive import strategies. Algeria, Egypt, Qatar are examples of these countries. Some of them imposed export restrictions. Egypt and Algeria did that, for example. And of course, they went on immediately, quite smartly, and attempted to diversify trade partners. Jordan, Egypt, Qatar are some of the countries that did that. The UAE also did this. They also improved their local production and the logistics. And the UAE, Kuwait, KSA, Algeria, Egypt were some of the countries that have done that. Some of them revived the overseas agricultural investment and dressed them differently. The KSA, for example, have some project in Ukraine. And while overseas agricultural investment had been frowned upon by the international community for a long time, this time it seems that some of the systems that have been set up appear to have, not to have attracted the ires of the global civil society community. And of course, smart technologies had a role to play, as I had explained earlier, and these were very quickly adopted and used into the system. So these all of these I call resilience capacities. Now they're important because they actually, some of them were adopted. And these were adopted at the level of the food supply chain. So they looked, it's okay, let's work out this food supply chain. Now, of course, they also worked at the level, but less, of building the resilience capacities at the level of the food environment and the individual level filters, some of them. For example, in many Arab countries, NGOs and civil societies distributed food aid to vulnerable families and families in need. And the government implemented laws and policies to stabilize food prices, and also state and government offered in some places cash money to protect some small businesses and workers whose income were affected by the pandemic. And you can see here some of the countries that have done that. And you can actually see, also refreshingly, that the work of civil society was rather intense during this period. As you can see that many of the countries, this is where you see most of the countries being listed, and I haven't listed all of them. This is just an example, but that has been quite intense during that period. Now, of course, we need to try to evaluate that, and it's a bit too early to see how many people were covered, whether everyone was impacted, whether they stopped doing that, whether they did it only for a while. But at least there was an attempt to beef up this resilience. Individual level filters, consumer choices, diets, they were left on the side. Let's see what we can say about these Arab responses. Well, the thing that one can immediately notice is that, with the exception of conflict countries, which are a whole area of work on its own that I have not addressed today here, Arab countries were generally not caught unprepared by the pandemic. And why were they not caught? Because they were caught unprepared in 2008 by the global financial and food crisis. And since then, systematically and methodically, those who could afford it have tried to improve their food security. They're still on track. There is still a long way to go, but there has been tens, if not hundreds, of projects aimed at putting down strategies, policies in order to prepare for a shock that would affect food security and nutrition. And we have seen that some of this had been already on the agenda and that they immediately worked in order to address it. Now, the ones that could act swiftly and decisively and impactfully were, of course, the richer ones. So this entire resilience has to do with the ability of allocating funds to responding to a crisis. And this has to do with a lot of issues. One of them is, what is the food that we eat and how do we eat it and how expensive it is, and therefore how much money do you need in order to continue consuming the way you consume. So that's an entirely different issue. Now, the other issue is the following. The food security concern, as I have presented from the state of food insecurity in the Arab region, the main concern in most Arab countries is with overnutrition and malnutrition rather than undernutrition. Yet the responses with the resilience built in only addressed the fear of food shortages. While the approaches to food security and nutrition in the Arab regions have greatly evolved since 2008, where we were still hearing discourses about the need to plant wheat in the desert, etc., this has been dropped. The focus is still placed on food availability and access to food, regardless of the diet and the healthiness. Although we know now that we die more of eating too much in those countries, at least, than from eating too little. This is an issue that has been left and has not been addressed as much as all the other issues of food availability have been addressed. Largely, although there has been some work on dietary guidelines, etc., the issue of diets and nutrition remains neglected. The issue of diet's impacts on the environment it's still completely in the dark. It's completely obfuscated. We don't talk about that, or very little. Some research papers here and there. I have colleagues who do great work about this at AUB, but this is essentially it. Now, other issues that may not have been raised enough, or for which we do not appear to have enough evidence to talk about, are the issues of social inequalities and environmental damage, as I said a minute ago, associated with the production systems and with disease-inducing diets. The response also did not address directly those issues, and the response with COVID may also in certain ways have exacerbated them. And of course, pandemics and illnesses, and COVID-19 uses these weaknesses in order to cause more human damage, as we have seen in the relationship between obesity and COVID-19 in one of my vignettes that has appeared earlier. Now, what can we say about the Arab food system resilience and / anti-fragility? Now, clearly, the countries have learned from the 2008 food crisis and strengthened some aspect of their food systems. They have displayed some aspects of anti-fragility because they became stronger after the shock of 2008. However, they're still focused on the food supply chain and on food security as an output of the food system. And that, we know, is not enough, because this is doomed to failure. And we may not understand why we are failing, because we are unable to see the system operating in all its globality. One must be careful at this point that when we talk about resilience in the current food system, that we may be seeking to induce resilience and robustness in a food system that fails people's health, that fails social justice, and fails the environment. This may end up causing more failure. This is why resilience must necessarily be associated with sustainability that I have presented earlier. If our response to crises is to make our health and environment damaging food systems more resilient, so our health damaging food system, environmentally damaging food system, if we are seeking to make these more resilient, then we're likely to become anti-fragile, because they will be with us and able to respond to shocks, and they are not producing the outputs, the sustainable outputs that we want. Now, what can we do next? The key to anti-fragility is diversity. We must strive to include it in every component of the food system. First, we need to adopt a food system perspective, but we need to include it into every component of the food system in order to enhance its responses to shocks. Diversity of production, diversity of suppliers, diversity in logistics, diversity in the food environment, diversity in diets. There is a lot of work to be done at the level of the individual filter and the consumer choices components of the food system. Now that we're mapping the food system, we can understand where there are shortcomings. The great challenge remains how to make healthy diets affordable to all, whether during a shock, a disturbance, or in regular times. This is today our great challenge, the affordability of healthy diets to all. And we have seen I think in my first vignette that, well, we know very little about the region, and what we know doesn't seem to indicate a very good situation. There is data around, by the way, in the SOFI 2020 about that, and you'll see more of it coming, but we do not have time to delve into that in here. Now, as I wrap up, I would like to bring back my takeaway messages from this lecture. One is that food system approach provides a lens through which we can view food security as one of the outcomes of a complex system. The food system framework helps us plan, design, and execute. our goal should be to make the food system anti-fragile by building in anti-fragility into all its components. And thirdly, there is zero benefit in trying to strengthen a food system that is failing society and nature. And four, the transition to a healthy, equitable, and environmentally protecting food system must be our priority in the Arab region as elsewhere. The best way to address pandemics is to avoid creating the conditions for their birth, spread, and virulence. Let me end on this positive note, or somehow. We have to move forward. COVID-19 is an opportunity to initiate the transition towards the great food system transformation. Arab countries must be part of this movement, and they are not today, at least not in the international forum. After a shock, we cannot strive to go back to normal because it is normal that is killing us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zurayk, for an excellent and engaging talk about an extremely important issue that I think all of us need to think about much more carefully than we might already be doing. We have a number of questions in the Q&A box. Those of you who are participating can click at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It says Q&A. Click on there, and you can post some questions for Professor Zurayk, which I will read out to him now. This is in no particular order, but I'll have a few questions myself. So this is from Milika saying, you mentioned, Professor Zurayk, that the rising prices are spurring a global stockpile of food. What would you suggest is the best way to respond to and prevent so-called hoarding of food, which ultimately leads to extreme shortages in other markets? And thank you for the talk, she says.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm not a particular aficionado of the WTO or all of the rounds, but there is a decision that we need to take at some point. There are countries in the world that need to import food. They need trade. Now, what food in what quantities is determined by the diets that we eat. The countries should, of course, improve their sustainable production, especially the production of healthy diet components, to the maximum that they can within the limits of their own environmental and social boundaries. But once this is done, there are countries that will need to continue importing food. You are currently, I mean, I don't know if you're in the UAE, but you would be in one of those countries. And in the Arab countries, that's going to be quite a lot. We need to try to reach an agreement, and an agreement that is not just driven by profit and return margins, profit margins, pardon me, and return, an agreement that's driven by humanity in order to be able to keep the goods and trade flowing to those countries and to those segments of society that need them most. Now, we may be a long way from reaching that, but there has been several attempts at doing this.
Very good. Thank you for that response. Zainab Ahmed has a number of questions that include issues related to smart responses to the challenges of food security, such as the use of artificial intelligence or contactless approaches. She points out that one of the first sets of big cases she'd read about was meat processing plants, abattoirs being shut down because of this situation, and the mandate for social distancing and contactless production. So just wondering if you might have some thoughts about smart applications that might help alleviate some elements of this.
I think, the fact that we're sitting across several thousand miles talking through a screen is an indication that of the importance of digital technologies in being able to respond and answer and support the answer and the sharing of knowledge of goods and their production. There are no two ways about that. However, there are questions of equities that are associated with these issues. So we need to understand very well who can afford this digital transformation. Is it going to leave people behind? And these are also issues that are very important. We tend to forget sometimes when we live in a privileged, or we are in a privileged position, as I am, and as we, many of us here are, we tend to forget that there is a different world out there which cannot afford the laptop, the smartphone, etc. So if digital technologies are going to be the savior, they need to be the savior of everyone and leave no one behind.
Yeah, I like the focus on inequality and social justice. This raises a question I have. When you talk about the food system, many scholars also talk about food regimes, including neoliberal or capitalist ones, reformist ones, more radical ones. For the discussions or discourse on food security tends to be more on the reformist end. The system is okay, but it just needs to be fixed. But you seem to be calling for something that's a lot more fundamental in terms of our reassessment of the food system itself. I'm wondering what you might make of calls from the food justice movements like slow food, or even other more radical ones, the food sovereignty movement like La Via Campesina, for example, who call for the dismantling of the food system the way it's understood, the way food is produced, distributed, and consumed, and a reevaluation of that in general terms. And also, how can the Arab world hitch its cart to the horse of food sovereignty or food justice? Or is that something that's not feasible given the geographical restrictions, environmental restrictions?
Food sovereignty, you've presented me, you know that I'm one of the founders of the Arab Food Sovereignty Network, and that's a network that includes, close to 50 farmers, associations, and civil society groups from Mauritania all the way to Yemen, and therefore we're quite active on this. And if I wasn't a believer that the concept of food sovereignty brings something to us, then I wouldn't be talking about it. Everything I said today is about food sovereignty. But food sovereignty doesn't mean that we need to just stop importing everything and just live with what we have. It means that we need to involve and to support and to understand the relationship between society and food, society and farming, society and the environment. All these outputs that I listed, environmental, economic, food and security and nutrition, and social, but equity and social, these are outputs that the food sovereignty movement moves for. Now, food sovereignty may not bear the same meaning everywhere. You got me started on something you don't want to get me started on that. So I'm going to wrap up quickly and tell you it's a fabulous tool for mobilizing and for finding one's own agencies. But depending on the context in which you are, it will take several forms, as long as social justice, environmental justice, food justice, and economic justice are the key outputs of this movement.
Thank you for the response. Excellent. And of course, Lebanon is often the leader in these areas. I'm thinking of Kamal Muzawak's work with Souq al-Tayyib and Tawlet, Lebanon, and so forth, or Beirut. That's really great. Some more questions coming in. This one's from Umair. Great talk, Dr. Zurayk. Thank you for the insights. He says he's curious how significant you think the availability of a healthy and nutritious diet actually is versus consumer choice to be healthy. Is it really such a big problem in the food system today? You said that the issue of diets and nutrition remains neglected. But Umair says he can imagine some that would argue that's not really the case, that people should be able to choose what they want, and as long as they're getting enough calories, who cares? Khalas.
Sure. Okay, but are people really choosing what they want? That's a big question, right? What's the role of advertising? What's the role of cultural memes? Things that we pass from one to the other. Do we really think that we're free in the choices that we make? I would challenge that. I mean, that may not be the best platform to challenge it, but I would absolutely challenge that. And the entire issue of the food environment deals with this. Once the advertising and the promotion of healthy diets is given as much money as one of those big food corporations, then we will talk about freedom. But how can we have the same level of freedom of choice when the playing field is completely slanted?
Very nice response. Here's a great question from Albert Goldson, who is the CEO of a Cerulean Council, a New York City-based think tank. He asks, Climate change has adversely impacted agricultural production through floods, droughts, and epic locust swarms. What should governments do to mitigate this trend? Raising the important question of climate change and the environment in terms of challenges for food security and sovereignty and everything else.
Well, I mean, if you're sitting in New York, I have one word to say, the Paris Protocol. But, you know, you're voting soon, so there it is. I mean, governments have to shoulder their responsibilities. That is, you know, something that the countries and societies and industries that create climate change need to take very serious action in reversing that trend. We know how to do that, by the way. And agriculture can be part of this, and food, the diet that we eat, is part of this. I'd attract your attention to the Eat Lancet Commission's report, which appeared last year. I was, honored to be a commissioner in this, and one of the authors of the report. And in it, we really explore completely the issue of the relationship between climate change and reversing these trends, staying within planetary boundaries, and the diets that we eat. And a lot of work has come out after that. I have colleagues at the American University of Beirut who are also working on these issues. So yes, indeed, this is important. We also know that there are a lot of nutritional guidelines in many countries in the world. And one needs to make sure that these nutritional guidelines are in tune and in phase with environmental sustainability, because we're finding that a lot of these are actually, if you apply them, they do not provide you with a diet that is compatible with environmental requirements in order to stay within planetary boundaries.
Yeah, Marin Nessel pointed that out very clearly in her work on the American food diet, food pyramid, which was basically designed by the food agri-tech industries and did not serve the health and well-being of the American people, which relates to a question someone else asked about comparisons between different food systems in the Arab world and the US. There's a really nice question from Jabber, who says, given that 30% of our food produced is wasted, what can we do to prevent high food waste? What are some strategies that individuals, institutions, and even governments can do to prevent that?
Okay, well, let me first just say that this is a two-level system. One of them is food losses, which is what is lost through agriculture, all the way to when it gets to the supermarket and when consumers purchase it. And then you have wastes, which happen at the level of the consumer. Now, food losses can be tremendous because of poor access to technologies when you harvest, when you transport, in logistics, when pre-cooling alone and post-harvest technologies and techniques will go a long way in helping preventing those losses. Storage issues are also extremely important. Generally, countries that can afford it have less losses than countries that can't, although they can also throw away food at the level of the farm when you have a glut in order to keep the prices leveled for improving profits. At the level of household waste, that also is an issue that can be dealt with. And we have a lot of those methods and technology. To start with, buy only what you need. And, buy on time. Cook as much as you will eat. Eat for 2 or 3 days. Share your food or your leftover with others, with food banks and others. Food waste has been reduced, by the way, during the pandemic, because the HoReCa sector, hospitality, used to be a great source of food waste. But there are, at the level of the civil society is doing a great job at the level of food waste in many countries.
It's funny that you raised how in the era of COVID that the food waste may have been diminished. Dr. Kishwar Ali asks, he's wondering if COVID-19 has actually slowed down climate change somehow because of the lack of transport, and that we might need similar lockdown measures going into the future just to stabilize the food and environment system. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not going to go into the COVID-19 is good for the environment debate because I do not have the data at hand to talk about it. So I'm going to leave this for a quick Google to answer, and I can actually talk about the issue of food consumption, right? Was that the second part of the question? Sorry, can you say again?
Yeah, I mean, he's asking if we'll need like similar lockdowns to prevent all the exhaust from airplanes and so forth to impact climate change. Yeah, I think it's a good question.
Okay, that's like rather radical as an approach, locking down everyone until climate change disappears. But, I'm sure you'll find supporters. I'm not necessarily one of those. I think we can get to a smarter solution in just questioning the way we consume the environment through our, purchases, through the economy that we're part of, through commodity fetishism, through many other aspects, and especially through food.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you might address the sort of elephant in the room here for the UAE and for many of the countries, not only in this region, but around the world, which is, of course, water. And in the food, energy, water nexus, water is often left out, and yet it's one of the most critical resources. And a large percentage of the water here in the UAE is desalinated, and that's not known to be a sustainable strategy for the future. So I'm just wondering how water might fit into your conceptualization of food security / sovereignty, both in general, but also more specifically for the Arab countries that are struggling with food and water security.
Okay, I'm going to go. A quick answer to that is that we know, like we have the figures for how much water, blue water, the water that is extracted rather than just rainfall. We know how much of this blue water we can use every year in every Arab country. We know that. It's the, percent of renewable water from the total water that is used, or the water that can be renewed. And every year you can actually calculate that. This gives you a very interesting, it gives you like a bank account of water where the currency is water. And then you got to decide what to do with that. Okay, so you make your own decisions after that, because we're all grown-ups here. And you can decide to put 80% of this into agriculture. That's one thing. You can decide that it's actually better for you to make good connectivity and good diversity and good relationships with neighbors, etc., and not try to use demagogically agriculture in terms of greening this or that desert or whatever at great expenses, unless it is a matter of political security, and I insist on the term, which we know exists quite a lot, and this becomes like an issue of national interest, etc. So we know actually it's up to us to budget. We actually know that. We know that in a place like the entire Arabic Peninsula, the renewable water supply won't allow you to grow enough food to feed the population. Now we can look at technologies. We can reuse wastewater, effluent water. We can adopt technologies that produce 5 times more with the same quantity of water, but you still have a zero-sum game that you need to abide by.
Very good. Thank you for that answer. I'm reminded of the Saudi experiment with producing wheat, and they used up all the blue water resources, or almost all of them, in the aquifer, and that was certainly not sustainable, despite the fact that the KSA was the 6th largest exporter of wheat in the world up until 2000 or so, because that's not sustainable. There are a number of questions coming in about practical measures to go forward to secure, specifically for this region, nutritional food and not just available food. What are some things? I know in the UAE, for example, there's a lot in smart technology, smart irrigation systems, vertical farms. Of course, this is not practical in all the nations of the region. What are some tangible, practical solutions you would recommend either to local leaders or to national leaders, even regionally?
I think that, okay, let me say something, which is we've not always eaten the way we're eating now. That's important, okay? And that historically, people have adopted diets which were way more in tune with the ecological resources that surround them. And that these diets were not necessarily bad diets, okay? They were diets that are adaptable. Let me say, for example, that in a place like the Levant, because I know more about the Levant, most of the food that we eat in our kitchen is adaptable to a very low meat input. You can actually cook everything we cook and use meat as a condiment. Now, that immediately shoots up the healthiness of your diet. Doesn't make it healthy, but it does influence it tremendously. Now, marry this, now dig into your traditional diet, revive them, adapt them, of course, to current demands, to our current knowledge of undernutrition, malnutrition, nutrients deficiency, adapt them to that, develop a diet that is not totally foreign to people, and then use the same tools that have forced the current global diet into us in order to propose this new diet with all the all the positive benefits of it. Now, technologies are important. The UAE, for example, going through growing lettuce on beds, on vertical, etc. I think that's good, by the way. I don't think that's necessarily bad, but that's the UAE. That is like, Abu Dhabi, Dubai. These are very special countries. You need to look at, how do you do that? How do you make that happen in Sudan? How do you make that happen in Yemen, for example? And therefore, this brings me to say that, well, you need to contextualize things. They don't work everywhere. You need to absolutely contextualize them. So dig into your traditions, bring them up, adapt them to the current levels, adopt some new technologies, promote them with the way the unhealthy diets are constantly being promoted today, and we know very well how it is, and take a very case-specific, region-specific oriented approach, and I think we'll be way better off.
Thank you for that response. It reminds us of the systemic nature of this challenge, and that we have to think systematically about all the elements that come together, including the cultural element that includes our own heritage, our past, our memories, and how we can adapt that going forward to make something that's more sustainable and nutritious and affordable. Again, the challenge is being affordable. I want to end, unless there are other questions coming in, you can send them into the Q&A. Your last slide said there's no going back to the normal because the normal was not a good normal. It was unhealthy for us. Do you remain optimistic about the future, both the near term and long term? What are some of your thoughts, say, for the next 10 to 20 years for this region in particular? Given all the studies you've done over the last 20, 30 years, and you've seen the arc of history, you see where we're headed. Are you optimistic?
I always am. You have to be optimistic because you need to wake up every morning and get out of bed and go to work and do something that you like doing. And there is only a healthy dose of optimism and of faith in human nature will actually bring this to you. Otherwise, you'll live your life miserable, and I'm not exactly a miserable person. But I can see that we're going through, the region is being shaken. We all know, more or less what the general trends are, where we are located between two tectonic plates that keep colliding and at different times and for the different reasons. And also, I think that our houses need to be put in order in our region here. Now, outside the political realm, for which I believe to have been cryptic enough, not to engage myself too much, I would like to go back to the issue of food. Now, food can be a good starting point for that. Because like everybody needs food, you need to make very important decisions. You need to save people's lives, and you can do that through food. You need to make them feel better. You need to make them feel more equal, less socially distant. You need to, that's a place where you can remove some of the privileges, decrease the fault that continues to grow between different segments and different income groups in society, which is one of the characteristics of the economic system that we live in. And I think that starting with food sovereignty, all of these great ideas, getting the youth involved in it, recognizing that, the roles of everyone in this, the role of the youth, the role of women, super importantly, in this, but starting from the food issue, bridging to environment, social equity, economic equity, I think there is a possibility of creating a wave from this starting point.
Thank you for that passionate defense of the future and for your optimism and for this extraordinary talk that was informative. as well as engaging. I want to remind the participants that the webinar was recorded, and if any friends or colleagues were unable to attend this talk or any past talks, the Institute invites you to tune into the YouTube channel where all these talks will be uploaded. You can follow the channel for future updates and look in the chat for that link. And with that, I want to thank Dr. Rami Zurayk for an outstanding talk. And please tune in again for future talks on behalf of the NYUAD Institute. Thank you very much. Shukran jazilan.
Thank you. Marhaba.